Way back in the spring of 1990, 10-year-old me was given a $5 allowance. In search of something to spend my money on, I came upon something fantastic at my local convenience store newsstand. It was then that I started a lifelong obsession with the gold standard of sequential art, the comic book. Now, as an old man, I have decided to open up some old boxes and dig into my comic book collection. I decided it's time for me to review and analyze the illustrations and artists that made me comics crazy. This is Chris Crazy House, and I want to welcome you once again to another episode of Chris Crazy House Presents Comics Crazy. And today we're going to be looking at Youngblood Strikefile #1. So before we looked at Youngblood Strikefile, we looked at the Die Hard story that was on this side of the comic. But now we're going to flip it over, and we are going to concentrate on a story that focuses on the character of Chapel. Now, Chapel was also a very popular character back then, and he was kind of like the CIA mercenary style character. He had a skull painted on his face, just a real badass character from that time period. And in this book, we finally get a solo story featuring Chapel. So we also know that Chapel was featured in the Spawn comics. Okay, Chapel is actually the one that killed Al Simmons, and that's what caused Al Simmons to be sent to hell to become Hellspawn. But in this book, we're going to focus on Chapel and a solo story, and it kind of flips around a little bit, or jumps around, where we get a little bit of his past and a little bit of what's going on in the present. And this has a little bit more story than the Die Hard story that we looked at, but it is also extremely art heavy as well. So a little bit more story, but we are looking at the art of Jae Lee, and that is the main thing we're going to be concentrating on. So this is when Jae Lee was kind of like really unleashed on the comic scene. We had seen some books from him before, because I remember where he worked on like some backup stories, and one of the ones that I remember most of all was in Marvel Comics Presents, where he did a backup story with the Beast from the X-Men. I really enjoyed that story. It was actually a pretty cool story of the Beast and fighting the Constrictor and the Super Apes and stuff like that, and the Red Ghost. That was actually a pretty good backup story. But now we're actually getting him, really going in and just flourishing with his style. And, if anyone's a fan of Jae Lee, you know that his style changed a lot over the years, where it used to be more like this, but now it's a little bit more, I guess you could say, realistic. He still does very heavy with the shadows and the silhouettes, but it's a lot more realistic and minimalist now when you look at it. This right here is just straight up surrealism, extreme poses, and everything going on with his artwork. And just looking at this cover here of the character of Chapel coming towards you with a knife in his hand, you see how he has, just exaggerated the shoulder length of Chapel. No one is actually, really structured like this, but, the extreme exaggeration of the shoulders, all the really tight veins in his muscles and his neck, and the skull is really just supposed to be face paint, but when you zoom in on that face, it looks like this is Chapel's actual skull peeking out, and he has fangs and everything. Like it's bizarre, because the character of Chapel doesn't look like this, but with Jae Lee's style and his surrealism, I think Rob Liefeld just gave him a license to just go as crazy as he wanted with this character. And you can see some bullet holes in him here You're like, what the hell is going on? Did Chapel get shot? Is Chapel immortal? Is he a zombie? What's going on here? But like I said, it's all part of Jae Lee's art style. So this cover is amazing. I remember when I picked this book up, obviously I was very, enthused about reading the story with Die Hard because he was my favorite character. But when I saw this cover right here with Chapel, I was like, man, this looks crazy. And I was so glad that I was kind of getting, 2 for 1 with buying this one book here. So let's crack it open and take a look at the story featuring the character of Chapel. So we check out the inside cover here, and we get to see the credits, and we see that Rob Liefeld is the one that created the story. Chapel obviously is his character, and he kind of gave the overall arching plot of this story. But the script is actually written by Rob Liefeld and Eric Stevenson, and all the pencils and inks are done by Jae Lee. And once again, we have the color design and separations done by Steve Olive and Ollie Optics. So we still get that really amazing and crisp colors done, these digital colors that are being done now. This is something new, but it is still very well done. And what we have here is those crisp digital colors done with Jae Lee's pencil and ink style. And it just creates a whole different dynamic than what we saw with the Die Hard story. So, it opens up here. We are looking at Chapel's personal files, and he's kind of reminiscing on the past. And it's Chapel, Al Simmons, who once again becomes Spawn, and their partner Duke. And they're, scoping out this facility on the docks, and they're raiding the base of this group known as Cybernet, which is a terrorist organization. Now, this is not to be confused with Cyber Data that we saw in the Die Hard story, nor is it to be confused with Cyber Force that was in Mark Silvestri's comics, back during the early 90s, okay? There's a lot of stuff going on here, lots of cyber in all the names that was popular back then. So lots of heroes and villains had the cyber in their name. So, we see the 3 mercenaries from the CIA raiding the base of this terrorist group. And this is a crazy shot here where, Chapel is basically firing off his guns, but almost looks like he has like power coming out of his hands, just how surreal this looks. This is a very cool shot too, by the way, the fact that they used Chapel's body almost as like a framing device for Al Simmons and Duke in the background. You see Al here, and Duke is all the way in the background. You kind of just see the red of his shades and just a silhouette of him. And we see Chapel once again, and like I said, these character designs are just very, I keep using the word surreal. Everything's very stretched out. It's not your typical anatomy, so we don't have to worry about that. But there's lots of weird things going on here with the shadows, lots of jagged edges and knives and stuff. But you see he's blowing apart these cyborg grunts here, and their pieces are flying of them, parts of their body are flying apart, their arms are coming off. So they're wrecking shop on these terrorists right now. And we get a cool page here where it's almost kind of like a double splash page of, the action starts here, but you still get to see, Chapel kind of kicking in the door. And my wife, this is one of the reasons she's not a comic book fan, because she'll open up a page like this and her eyes will be drawn to this image, which is what's supposed to be, but she doesn't understand you're supposed to read this first. So that's the only problem she always had with comic books, is because she doesn't know what to read first. She tells me that all the time when she tries to read some of the books that I have. But yeah, that's just the way the art style is. And it's just trying to create a very, just a fun page. And like I said, your eye is drawn here just because the way the colors are, the way it's structured, and the way it's composited and composed. But, you got to start up here. And maybe you have to think about that when you are creating your own books, to make sure that your reader understands how your book is supposed to be read, and know how the narrative is supposed to flow. Okay, so make sure you understand that when you're creating your own books. And you know, even if someone is not the biggest comic book fan, they understand how to read your book, because you want everyone to be able to understand it and have as much fun reading it as, you know, even a big comic book fan like myself. But you see, we continue here with the Cyborgs getting completely destroyed by Chapel and his buddies. Like I said, you see heads flying off, the characters being blown back, getting shot in the mouth. And this is a very cool shot right here where Chapel's kind of just walking through the wreckage, and you see the fire there. And they come up on the facility. You see the silhouette of the smokestacks and stuff like that. The access code doesn't work, so that's when we get to this scene right here where Chapel's just basically kicking in the door. Very cool scene and very cool pose of him, where he looks very intimidating, of him kicking this door open. And when they get in there, they see that they're being ambushed by some more soldiers and more guns being pulled out and drawn on them. Very cool way of showcasing this, by the way, where the guns look bigger than they are. You know, you can see that the guns are in the foreground, and we're kind of getting a first-person perspective of the enemy pointing the guns at the characters, and they look very small within the whole of that silhouette there of the doorway. And that's when we get the famous double splash page of this issue, where you got Chapel, Al Simmons, and Duke just firing their weapons. And this page is amazing. I remember when I first saw this and just being floored by the way this artwork looked. Not only that, and I'll just be honest with you, just because me being a young black teenager at the time, just seeing black characters portrayed this way, where they starting to look more like black guys that you would see around the way. You know, this look was very popular in the late 80s, early 90s. I've seen people like this. I've seen, you know, obviously without the skull painted on their face, but I've seen brothers like this around the way when I was growing up in the late 80s, early 90s, with the gold chains, with the leather jacket open, maybe no shirt on, and the high and tight box or whatever. Maybe they might have some designs, you know, cut into their fade or whatever. But I've seen this look, okay? Very much have seen this growing up. And even Al Simmons, the way his hair looks, and just rocking the wife beater and the jeans, I've seen that too. So, you know, it's surreal, but also somewhat realistic in the way the characters are dressed. And once again, you get to see how, you know, just the extreme pose, the way the body is kind of pulled and stretched out. It almost reminds you of animation or something that you would see from Peter Chung at the time. If anyone's ever seen Aeon Flux, that was a very popular underground cartoon. It used to come on Liquid Television at the time. And that's what this art style kind of reminds me of, like looking at it here. It reminds me a lot of what you saw on like Aeon Flux, just that extreme, you know, shapes to the bodies, and the body parts almost look like they're kind of weird and twisted. And, you know, you got the guns here in the silhouette and firing off here. And I like the way that the fire is coming out of the guns as well. You almost kind of have like that painted look to it as they're shooting at the enemy. Getting more into the action now of Chapel and his boys fighting these cyborg monsters, and Chapel's literally jumping into the air and shooting down on them. So this dude he's wilding, you know, he's going all out in the way that he's killing these creatures. And even right here, this is another one of my favorite panels from this book, where Chapel is literally, he took out one of his knives and is slicing open the head of one of these cyborgs. And I just love the way it looks. It's just so, it's so out there. You know, it reminds me of something you might even see with not just animation, but also like graffiti or something like that. It's just so gritty and so raw, the way the style looks. And I mean, the way the, you know, the bullet bandoliers are kind of draped around him, the way the knife looks. It's not your typical knife. It's got weird spikes. I mean, even knives that do have the spikes coming out don't look like this. You know, there's a lot of weird stuff going on here, but I love it. It's done in an amazing way. And we got Chapel standing triumphantly over the dead bodies of these creatures. And that's when we come to face with the big villain of this story. And the character's name is Giger. And he is the leader of these cybernet terrorists. And he's one of the characters that we see as a bad guy throughout a lot of the Youngblood books. And like I said, this is a backstory And we see Giger kind of showcasing right here. And you really just see his face on the screen, but he looks very maniacal in this shot. And you see the characters here kind of seeing him on the view screen. You see their silhouette in the foreground. This is something that Jae Lee did a lot in the way that he did his silhouettes of just kind of like a face kind of peering out of the shadows, and basically just saying that, you know, this is the story part of it anyway. It's just Giger and Chapel going back and forth, kind of taunting each other, and they realize that Giger has rigged the entire base to explode. So of course the heroes got to get out of there quick, and that's when they start running. But while they're running, Al Simmons tells his friend, their partner Duke, to hold up, and winds up popping his top. So you can call Al Simmons' gun the can opener, because it takes this dude's top right off. All right. And we find out apparently that Duke must have been a traitor, and he was selling secrets behind the back of the CIA. So they wind up actually killing him on this mission. So only Al Simmons and Chapel get out of this explosion alive, and we see the explosion going off in the background as the two heroes get away and leave Duke's body behind. This was very stark and very interesting. Like this reminds me of like anime, where they have the very stylized violence. Like if you ever saw the Fist of the North Star animated movie, or, you know, anything done by Kawajiri, just how the very stylistic violence, it wasn't just gratuitous for the sake of being gratuitous. They actually added some artistic merit to the violence in these books. So, and just like the anime, they show that there's some art in the violence. So the way that his head kind of splatters out like that, and you see kind of like the blood is like the paint splashes going on there. So think about that. If you're going to showcase violence in your book, you can add some artistic merit to it as well. It doesn't have to be just gratuitous just for the sake of being gratuitous. Same thing with this explosion. You see the characters in the foreground jumping away from the explosion, very similar to any action movie from the 80s or 90s. And you see the explosion going off in the background. Very well drawn, very well done, and it looks cool and artistic, even though it's basically just some good guys running away from an explosion. So here we got Chapel and Al Simmons talking to Jason Wynn, one of the villains from the Spawn series. We know that Jason Wynn, you know, was the head of the agency, and he was very much the big bad in a lot of the Spawn series. And, you know, Chapel and Al Simmons worked for him back then, so they're kind of just being debriefed at the end of their mission. And we already see that Al Simmons is actually starting to ask questions. He's wondering, like, what did Duke actually do that we had to actually kill him? And Jason Wynn is basically just saying that's above your pay grade. Don't ask too many more questions. So now we're here in the present, okay? And this could be confusing if you didn't actually read the actual captions of what's going on here. So this is in the past. This is the present. And we see Chapel once again talking to Jason Wynn, and Jason wants Chapel to start working for him again, even though Chapel is now a member of Youngblood and that is actually a celebrity at this point. Chapel says, "To hell with you," throws the papers back in Wynn's face and says, "I'm out. I'm not working for you anymore. You don't pull my strings anymore." And Jason decides, you know what? This boy's getting too big for his britches. I'm going to have to teach him a lesson. So he pushes the button here on his answer machine, calls his secretary, and basically is calling for the number of Giger, which is the terrorist that we just saw at the beginning of this story. And we're seeing a very surreal look of Jason Wynn smiling maniacally, looking like the villain that he is. And we see Chapel, his image being shattered in the background. So we know there's going to be some trouble for Chapel, and this guy is the cause of it. And this is where we get the to be continued for the next issue. So once again, very well done as far as the artwork goes in this story. a little bit more story driven than what we saw from the Die Hard story, but what we're concentrating on is the artwork. And Jae Lee's artwork is magnificent in this book. And we're going to continue on with Youngblood Strikefile number 2 as the story heats up. And we're going to see what Chapel discovers and who's, stabbing him in the back in this story. So I hope you folks enjoy what you saw so far. If you are a fan of Jae Lee's work, let me know what books that you like in the comments section. Also, go ahead and like this video if you enjoyed my review of Youngblood Strikefile number 1. And make sure you subscribe to this channel so that way you're here when I do the next issue of Youngblood Strikefile. Okay? So, anyway, folks, this is Chris Crazy House. I appreciate you all being here. And I will see you next time on Chris Crazy House Presents Comics Crazy. Peace.